All right. Hello, Ali. Hello, Steve. Thanks for being here, both for, I don't know even know what week this is. I've lost track now. Midway through our spring 21 semester to the Be Better Club. This week, we're talking about social media ethics with two podcasts that Ali, you suggested to us, I think. Um, Both are really interesting and both are focused on broadly social media ethics or ethical issues around the use of social media. So we're going to be talking about those two today. One is from Emmett Audio, and the other is from the All Things Over Landing podcast. Um, and we'll talk about the content. And Shanor, welcome to the Be Better Club this week. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So we'll just talk sort of informally through these podcasts and with the goal of kind of outlining ethical issues and thinking through them together for the next hour or so. So, Ali, since you made the suggestion, do you want to start us thinking about one or the other podcast?
Yeah, let me pop into an internet better zone and then I'll be happy to.
Okay. So yeah, the first podcast was.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. The first podcast was on moral responsibility generally in social media use, and the second one was on this really interesting connection between the outdoor principle of leave no trace and social media use, social media and bullying and environmental responsibility, which is a really intriguing connection, especially given the author of the podcast. So, Dr. Kerr, are you well situated?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I am.
Okay.
And actually, I'd like to start with the second one, the Overlander one,
Yeah.
just because that's the order I listened to them in, thinking, oh, this is interesting. And what I would start with is that this is the author, the speaker was discussing the leave no trace ethics, discussing how when you're using the outdoors, engaging in the outdoors, there's some kind of perhaps unwritten rules, but social standards to be respectful of the environment you're in. And then he went on to describe some that are written. So with the idea of educating people on what those rules are, understanding that maybe they don't know, maybe they just properly don't know how to take care of the environment and be respectful to others within that. So he went through a list of 7 different kind of leave no trace principles, which was new to me, even as somebody who's engaged in the outdoors quite a bit, because I understood leave no trace was kind of like pick up your trash afterwards, or don't cause permanent damage. So don't kick rocks down, don't create new trails in the woods, those kinds of things, which certainly were included in there. But then there were some additional kind of things to more broadly understand that leave no trace is really about minimizing your impact to zero. So leave no trace as though you weren't there. And so I thought that was interesting, engaging with the idea of how social media could follow those principles or support them, but also could be counter to that. So I heard these ideas that, take only pictures, leave only footprints. And when you're talking about social media, all of a sudden you're taking pictures that are then going out to the world and you're leaving digital footprints all over the place. So he was kind of engaging on how does that impact these policies? How does it positively, as in we educate people, or does it negatively, as in it encourages misuse of the outdoors, and or does and then later we'll talk about what he got into with what was going on in social media around bullying and stuff. But for the first part, it was just about considering how social media platforms can impact these principles of leave no trace.
Yeah, and the other thing that struck me, Ali, as I was listening to this podcast was I kept thinking like, wait, what is this podcast? It's the All Things Overlanding podcast, right? So this is a podcast about and targeted to an audience of like off-road 4x4 drivers who like drive at relatively speaking high speeds through wild land. And so leave no trace and overlanding seems like a complicated notion, like it does in social media. Like there's a leave no trace has this long history of like, privileged white people walking the Appalachian Trail and like literally carrying their trash out and making sure that they, only stepped on rocks so they didn't disturb the moss and like physically leaving no trace, but it was just them and their bodies. And so the only trace that they would leave besides footsteps would be like human waste, basically trash and refuse. And they would carry that out with them. But as soon as we step away from that, and now we're talking about automobile transportation and or social media impacts, like I'm not even sure what leave no trace means. It kind of takes on like a slipperiness a bit.
So I'm curious if others, whether you listen to the podcast or not, had thought too much about, say, the ethics of being in the great outdoors. So not just the social, the impact, the environmental impact, but just simply that, like as you're going off into the woods for camping or something like that, do you think about these principles?
Well, I didn't listen to the podcast, but I've certainly thought about the principles. I've got a history that Jonathan knows of having been in scouting for a long time. And I'm a Cub Master, so I've got little scouts to whom we teach this principle. And so it's conscious, it's on the forefront. I haven't really thought about its connection to electronic media, social media. That's intriguing. But I did hear you say something that was resonant that, and I don't know how you quite meant it, but what I heard was leave no trace is more about minimize your trace. And what I take that to mean is that there's really no such thing as leave no trace. As soon as you interact with the environment, you're going to impact it. So to some extent, there's an ethical decision there already. How are you going to do it? Are you just going to go on a hike? Are you going to bring an off-road vehicle? Are you going to bring a big crowd, that makes a lot of noise? How often are you going to go? We're not the only ones that interact with that environment. There's also wildlife there. So if we go hiking all the time and we have a substantial human presence, then that will impact the wildlife. So just the choice to go into the outdoors is a great one, but there's an impact and there's an ethical challenge there insofar as you can't leave no trace. You can't have zero impact, but you can strive to have a positive impact. So not everyone's going to be a perfect agent when they interact with the outdoors. So we tell our scouts, leave it better than you found it. Don't just pack out your trash. Pick up 5 pieces of trash, which is sometimes a hard sell in the COVID era, right? Because all of a sudden everyone's a germaphobe. A little dirt's not a bad thing, but come on, if you see some trash and it's just because it's not yours, pack it out. So maybe that offsets the balance a little bit. You go into the environment, you're going to leave footprints, you're going to scare a little wildlife. We're impacting their home as well, but we can make it better. I don't know if there's an equivalent in social media, but maybe you can ethically engage in social media and consciously try to leave a mark that is not just not negative, but is in fact positive by diligent interaction with information, by vetting information, and by thoughtfully putting out content with a goal to have a positive spread of knowledge, or and not just sounding off for the purpose of sounding off, and consciously understanding that you will have an impact when you put out information.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that, Steve, because that's specifically one of the things that this podcast author was talking about, was the idea that this is the bullying thing that I think that Ali mentioned. The podcast author was talking about the negativity that sometimes shows up on social media, and saying that one of his goals was to sort of balance the scale, so to speak, and to leave positive affirmation. At one point he says, he'll post things like, rather than going after the bully, he'll post things like, yeah, don't pay attention to what that person's saying. Like, you've done a great job here. Here's some ways you could improve. Like the sort of positive reinforcement model sounds like something you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. And I struggle with it. I do my Facebook posting as much as anyone. And if I'm in a bad mood, I suspect I'm leaving more negative trace than positive trace. But sometimes I do pat myself a little bit on the back when I back away from that. Maybe it's when I'm in a good mood, and I'll avoid a negative confrontation or, direct clash with someone. Whereas, and instead take the opportunity to post something that puts a positive light on a subject, without condemnation and recrimination. It's tough. I think Allison was going to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of the things that I love this idea of thinking about the social media as a place to either leave no trace, or if not a negative, at least a positive trace. And I think it's interesting that we really have to, it's like we're trying to go to the education piece of these things. Like you sort of have to give people the benefit of the doubt of like, okay, so maybe you just don't know how to respectfully engage with the environment. So how do I teach you this so that I can give you at least that benefit? And then if you're going to continue to choose it, what do I do with that space? So it wasn't highlighted too much, the education piece of these principles and this understanding, but Dr. Kubler, when you say, like with the Scouts and the Scouts mission being education and doing that, it is really an interesting responsibility piece that I don't know if I'm picking up on that because I'm an ethics educator, or if I'm picking up on that because I'm an ethics educator because I feel the education is one of the most important pieces of being ethical.
Yeah.
So can we, I guess yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm a teacher educator too, formally. And I remember just thinking about my own career path, sitting in a Chem 2 class, not knowing that I was going to become a professor, but thinking I should really learn this stuff because who knows? I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll teach it someday. And I think I just had lucky. I had somehow encoded into my DNA the sense of intrinsic importance of knowledge and intrinsic importance of properly transferring knowledge. Maybe respect for knowledge in and of itself. And so there's a contrapositive of that. There's a responsibility not to convey disinformation. And that's just kind of in my DNA. But I don't think I necessarily post things on social media as a conscious effort of teaching. And I don't think you have to do that. I mean, teaching is a real position of privilege and also one of hubris. When we say I'm a teacher, I know things, there's a huge responsibility and presumption associated with that. I'm increasingly realizing how infrequently I have 100% ownership of what's right. I'm constantly impressed and humbled by others who have a different perspective. So in some cases, I think whether it's me interacting with the Scouts or posting something on social media, it's more about being a little more self-effacing. And if there's leadership or teaching that's happening, maybe trying to do it through example. Taking a high road, not necessarily trying to pontificate. With the Scouts, I'm obviously trying to teach something. But even for them, I know they're watching me. And so it's more about example and setting example. So if I let my ire or irritation with someone get the best of me when I'm busy posting something on social media and I put out the negative vibe, I mean, that's on me. Then I've undermined that notion of teacher, but I just also undermine maybe responsibility we all share as just, humans engaging in a evolving form of imperfect communication, and not really being conscious of what the detrimental impacts will be if we don't engage with it thoughtfully, and if we don't focus on trying to put out proper and positive information, positive communication. I think it's very, very hard, and we're presumptuous if we run around thinking everything is a teaching opportunity. I mean, it is to some extent, or I'm going to post this to teach you. I think there's a lot to unpack there.
I agree. I think that's why I liked so much this idea of thinking about ethics in the place of both responsibility felt in engaging with the outdoors, and then on the juxtaposition of social media. One of the surprising things, because again, I was like, how are you going to connect this? What's happening here? And one of the big connector pieces was like, if a social media influencer posts this picture of this place or posts a meetup of sorts, then you get a whole bunch of people going there, which then puts a strain on that area of the environment, the nature, or something like that. So it was really interesting to see how, unbeknownst to an influencer, you take this pretty picture on this overlook, or worse, you take a picture of you doing something, pushing a rock over or something, the impact of that influence can have. And again, you said thoughtfully engaging with these, and I think that's the part that I didn't know that that's how it was going to connect. I was like, oh, yeah, because there's responsibility in our social media posting to a certain extent.
On the flip side of that, and Shenor and Jose, feel free to weigh in either by chat or just to interrupt us. But on the flip side of that, right, social media has been used in the last couple of years, especially to, social media influencers have used it to post graffiti that they've made in national parks, for instance. But then that same social media has led to the arrest of social media influencers who have left those graffiti. So it's amplified, I think, a tendency to leave traces in the first place, which is really fascinating to me.
I guess I have a different view. For me, my compass tends to be whatever I say or do is a reflection on me. And so that always kind of gives me a pause before, I act or I speak. And so I have no social media presence except for LinkedIn. And so I just kind of, I think to me, it's hard as to how you teach someone ethics. I don't see that as something, it's something intrinsic within a person. Sure, you can share ideas and you can try to enlighten someone, but I think it's very internally motivated. So so that is how I sort of approach things. And even when when I hear something or I view somebody, and I don't view a person who is who is upset, and I don't see that as being I don't see the person at the receiving end as how do you, in a negative light. I see more of a person who is actually committing the act. So it's just a different perspective, I think. So just to kind of add that to the conversation as we're talking.
Yeah, thanks, Shanor. That's really interesting. The distinction we're making is between sort of, if we stick with the national parks example, the graffiti artist and the viewers on Instagram, right? That both have a responsibility, but the ethical onus lies on the graffiti artist, right? Or on the influencer, not on the viewers. And yet the influencer wouldn't be who the influencer is without the viewers. So there's some sort of like weird ecosystem there that we're trying to get at in terms of this rights and responsibilities exchange. And that is really complicated, especially when our influencees might be a global phenomenon, right? There might be no like proximateness from the audience to the actor.
So what you have said, Dr. Beaver, that sort of translates in so many different situations. And I guess the one that just kind of popped up in my head, and I don't know why, is human trafficking, right?
Okay.
So it's the same kind of issue, the people who are doing human trafficking, but then there is also that audience that if it wasn't there, there wouldn't be that commodity out there.
So yeah, if we take the absolutely horrible track and talk about that in sort of commodity language, there's the buyer and the seller, and the same sort of principle holds there, that you would think, Shanor, the moral responsibility, or the moral onus at least, lies on the seller who's putting the product to market, so to speak. And again, this feels really dirty to talk in this language in the context of human trafficking. But then there's this other component that the seller wouldn't have a job, wouldn't have a product without the audience or the buyers. But still the ethical weight should fall on the seller and not necessarily the buyer.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that. I almost think it's it's almost that thing again in when there is an extramarital affair, who do you hold responsible? Your spouse or the person they're having affair with? And a lot of times people go after the third party. And to me, that just doesn't sit well. That third party has no responsibility to you, or at least doesn't have greater responsibility than your spouse.
Okay.
So why do you feel like you have more right against that person than your own spouse? So to me, I don't know. I mean, you know that the seller is driven by money, which is sort of a driving force for everybody. But then to me, the buyer, their drive seems to be even more, how do you say it? For a lack of a better word that I can't think of, is more problematic or more corrupt than just the financial aspect of it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We've moved between several really complicated ethical issues, right? So extramarital affairs, human trafficking, social media bullying, and we've tried to build some connections. And one of the things, Shanor, you said really stuck with me, that in the case of extramarital affairs, there seems to be something more morally relevant or ethically salient about the connection between the partners than that third party rogue in the closet, or whatever, however you want to describe this person. And that idea that relationship, the proximity of the relationship or the strength of a relationship really matters, might translate really well up this chain of examples. Because if we bring that example or that idea back to social media, one argument you might have is that, stick with the Overlanding podcast, this particular podcaster's audience who have this like maybe weekly or bi-weekly relationship with them. So the influencer to influencee, right? The tighter that relationship is, the more responsibility lies in that ecosystem. But if it's just one random person who watches, like us maybe, watches one episode of a podcast and then does some evaluation work and makes some judgment, that's a less proximate relationship. So maybe there's something to be said, and this feels like kind of an ethics of care approach to me. This feels like the tighter the relationship is, the more tightly that right and responsibility is bound up. And the farther you get away, the more we can assign responsibility to one party versus another. I don't know, Shane, I don't know if that's helpful or even on track, but you got me thinking at least. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and then let me just push that. I don't want to derail us too much, but I was thinking about this too. You can push that idea of responsibility and proximity even further, because if what we're thinking about is leave no trace, this author is talking about bullying, which is a pretty proximate relationship between, a group, a community, an online community, basically. But then if you push this idea of leave no trace further, you might think, for instance, right, Bitcoin mining is as energy intensive as some countries. So last year's energy consumption for mining Bitcoins, they used as much energy as Argentina did as a whole country, right, to mine Bitcoins. So cryptocurrency is incredibly energy intensive. So here's an environmental impact of a digital function or process that we usually don't think at all about. And this all comes from, right, heat produced from solar farms and energy consumed and et cetera, et cetera. But the real world environmental impacts of digital stuff, social media, Bitcoin mining, all that, server farms, is yet another piece of this leave no trace puzzle, but is much less proximate.
So I was just going to hop around it for a second too, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. So to reiterate, the first podcast we were listening to was called All Things Overlanding, and it was a leave no trace in the internet. So season 1, episode 25. The next one was Emmett Audio, which had a episode on November 9th called Our Moral Responsibility for How We Use Social Media. And this author speaker is Emmett Van Driesch. He has a tree farm and hand carves spoons, among other things. So he has blogs and this podcast, which is kind of a daily thing he does. So it honestly sounded like he was walking and talking on the podcast. Like he was breathing not super heavy, but kind of like, so I don't know if it's what he does when he walks out in his tree farm or not. But to me, it felt like it was much more of a conversation. And he was really going into kind of the nitty gritty of using social media. So he was explaining that I've used all of them to become educated and about them. And then I've refined it. And then I'm reflecting on how I refine this. So how I choose who I follow, how I respond to those that follow me. And the reason why I'm pulling this one into this is because one of the pieces he said in there was talking about basically retweeting or reposting, and he was pretty adamantly like, I don't do that. I don't do that at all. If I do, I try to put it in my own words. I try to make my own statement, or I need to be very clear that if I'm ever retweeting, that is now my opinion that I'm owning, not just passing along somebody's other opinion. So he was really, I think, taking responsibility for anything that goes on in his social media presence, not just what he posts, but what goes on. So what are your thoughts when I tell you about this? And what good or problematic things would you anticipate out of that stance?
Well, I was curious about what it means to take ownership of opinion by rephrasing if you're going to make a tweet and not just passing on directly what was inspiring you. I mean, it kind of sounds like, new form of plagiarism. We've talked about that in this forum as well. But I guess it's like, why, what are the negatives? I'm not really clear. What are the negatives of not reposting the original material for what it's worth? I mean, you know,
Well,
yeah, you want to give credit and all that, but I guess where I'm thinking is, how does one assume greater responsibility by regurgitating the wording and saying, okay, now this is my opinion. It's no more your opinion because you've rephrased and recapitulated the content than it is if you repost that and say, here is something, that inspired me, that I think is important, that I would impose upon you and suggest if you find some time, read it as well. You might be similarly inspired, but I still own it for passing on that recommendation, but I don't own the content in any way. I'm just inspired by it and invite you to be inspired with me. I mean, I'm not really sure I see any greater moral high ground achieved or whatever in the position that he takes. So it's a little confusing for me.
yeah,
I'm missing the point.
the argument he offered in that podcast is he says at one point that reposting is inherently sloppy. So I think what he was getting at is that there's a time and a thoughtfulness element that goes into reformulating an idea and then putting it out as your own. And he talks about the sloppiness becoming a slipperiness, where he says, like, I'll paraphrase, it's a short hike from cat memes to shit posting, right? The idea that like we can just share a cat meme and it's funny, but if we get into that habit, we might end up sharing a view that is just ignorant or false or something that we don't agree with. And so unless there's that element of like pausing and thinking and reformulating and then sharing as your own. So again, I think it's just that time and energy element, but it does open that door. And I hadn't thought about that. It opens up that door to really plagiarizing, right? You're no longer crediting a source necessarily, or if you, I guess there's a way in which you could do that. He mentions right at the beginning of this podcast that he got thinking about this topic because of a podcast, another podcast that he listened to that got him worrying about these sorts of concerns. So in some way he is like directing our attention to a source or a point of inspiration for his own thinking. But yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and I didn't mean to just harp on or buy into plagiarism, which I think is a little banal. I mean, we all know we ain't supposed to do it, and this gets beat to death, and still people plagiarize. So it's worth restating. But I mean, I feel like that one's an easy concept to kind of understand and move on from. What I'm wondering is, so if I read something really interesting, if I read the article from the woman who processed, what was it, like 5 terabytes of data to get the first decent image of a black hole, am I supposed to regurgitate her information and say, here it is? Or am I not just going to say, this is really good information, there it is? I mean, to some extent, I'm not the expert. So is it not presumptuous of self-absorbed expertise that you just think you have? And so you're gonna rephrase everything in your own words and then call that assuming responsibility. I mean, I see both sides. He thinks it's a slippery slope. Maybe I haven't listened to the article, but maybe he stands on a precipice that's slippery on both sides, and I wonder which side he's sliding down. I mean, there's a lot to be said for showing the original work. I mean, I've seen the Mona Lisa. I actually had the privilege to go to the Louvre and see it myself. But I don't tell my kids, hey, you got to see this really amazing picture. Let me redraw it for you. I let them look at it as best we can. Maybe one day we'll get to the Louvre, but show it to them and I say, look at those eyes. I'm just not going to be able to do it as well. So I don't know. I see both sides in terms of the argument of assuming responsibility.
Yeah, I have to admit, I had that red flag. So where Dr. Beaver, you maybe didn't, I did. So, a little over a month ago, we had this same discussion and our podcasts were around plagiarism, even within podcasts, and crediting others with their work. So I had that moment where I was like, excuse you, what? You rephrase it and then what happens? But to to the point of that slippery slope, I think what he really was trying to do was take that pause to I think it was to vet the work, because I think the difference too in what we're talking about comes down to the content that is being retweeted, right? So we're not saying he's taking credit for a great work of art or a rigorous work of research or anything of that nature. What we're saying is he's trying to take responsibility for propagating opinion, maybe even too. So like, if I see something discrediting somebody else, am I just going to retweet it and be like, oh, you all understand I'm discrediting them too? Or is he saying, if I'm going to discredit something, I would like to have vetted it, done my research, done and communicated a second opinion that is thoughtful, as opposed to just climbing on the backs of somebody else.
Yeah. And so Ali, I like that. I want to draw our attention here because I think what we're talking about now is plagiarizing facts versus plagiarizing opinions or views. And remember, or I don't think we talked about this, but the way this podcast started was that this spoon carver Emmett says, hey, I just listened to this Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan gets a lot of crap for various things, right? And everybody thinks they know what he's about and have these views of him, but he just interviewed Tristan Harris, this guy from Google, and it was an incredible interview. And so I wanted to rethink my perspective on Harris, like on Joe Rogan and his podcast, right? Maybe like the opinion that I inherited from my social media followings was the wrong one, right? Maybe it was underinformed or it was biased because this one interview was really spectacular. So the thing that the thing that he's talking through is his own opinion of Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan's podcast. So that is a little bit different than like the Mona Lisa or the plagiarism podcast we listened to, the podcast on plagiarism we listened to a couple of weeks ago, which are really about like not citing your sources for factual claims about, what was it, forensic science and murder cases, right? Seems like a different sort of thing. Now the space between facts and opinions in this context is blurry, granted. But I think like the plagiarism story we heard in the first week of this series this year, which again was about sort of the using without citation whole streams of facts from a crime podcast, true crime podcast, to this like, I had the wrong one view of Joe Rogan and this one episode changed my mind, so I need to rethink it for myself. That seems like a different kind of thing. Now, how to cash that out is tricky. Yeah. Just to stick there a second though, because I had to look this up. I hadn't seen it, and I have my own opinions of Joe Rogan. But Joe Rogan did interview Tristan Harris from Google, who worked on the AI project. And both of them had this really interesting Twitter back and forth about how great the interview was and how it went. But really, Harris's view is really, really interesting on AI's role vis-a-vis human decision making coming up in the future. So it's a super interesting podcast in and of itself. But that's where he started.
It's a nice little plug from 2 weeks from now with the Be Better, Be Better Club, because it's on AI and ethics.
It sure is.
Well placed.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, we'll talk more about that at the end. But yes, April 13th, where this group is talking specifically about AI ethics and autonomous vehicles. Yeah. And we're listening to this really interesting podcast by these two incredible scholars, Kubler and Beaver from WUCF. It's going to be spectacular. Just wait and see.
Yeah, I saw those names and I recognized them immediately. I thought,
setting ourselves
show up for that one. Just unless anybody has a pressing comment on what we've talked about so far, I would like to mix in more of this bullying from the Leave No Trace bullying on social media, because while both podcasts didn't talk about it, they both presenters really seem to be feeling an onus, a question, a thought about it. So to preface, the Leave No Trace podcast really got into, is it appropriate to bully people into taking care of the environment better? Or can we should we publicly be shaming misusers of the environment? Is that acceptable use of a platform? So while the first part really talked about how can we responsibly use our platforms and recognize the pitfalls of it and the impact that that could have inadvertently, now he's talking about, like, is there an inadvertent impact of using your platform to bully or shame? Is hard to, there's an example within it, Dr. Beaver, if you might remember the example of how they were bullying. But he also went into talking about overlander culture of basically shaming people for being irresponsible as opposed to helping them. So I don't remember the exact bullying on social media example. Do you have that one?
I don't have any specific notes. I couldn't tell you a time stamp on that bit.
I think it was also about, like, there were different types of lift kits and less responsible vehicles that the overlanders use. So basically different people. So even if you posted something good, it became fodder for different discussion that could turn into shaming. So I guess as an example for me, I was like, wow, I've never thought of this. And then about 20 minutes into this podcast, so almost over, I realized, oh my gosh, one time on Instagram, I posted or maybe retweeted even an article about Karens, because I have this like deep-rooted hatred of Karens. So these markers, that you stack up rocks and you make a marker so that people know where to have directions. Well, somewhere along the line, stacking rocks became art and play. So now you can go on these trails and there's rocks everywhere, these stacks of rocks. So my angsty opinion is I like to knock them down. Like, I like to get rid of them. I've read books on the history of cairns and where they are, and like rangers, like the amount of money spent on rangers having to remove and unstack cairns and put rocks back where they came from is ridiculous. Like, full-time jobs are around having to put rocks back to where they came from. Because historically, these were important markers. They let, like, if you're above tree line and you can't see anywhere, you do need to have these directions to go which way. But I'm a kayaker, and so people will stack up rocks on different things, and that's dangerous, because if you can't see your outlet and you have a divide in the river, one could be safe and one could not be. But when you have a cairn, it falsely indicates that that one's safe. It may not be. You need to read the river, and there's no etiquette, there's no river communication around cairns. You read the river, you read the water. Where the water is flowing is your most likely outlet. And there are a couple of other ways that boaters mark safety, but it's not with cairns. So people on the beach will stack up these cairns, and it's very confusing to an outdoorsman. So I posted something about like this, and oh my goodness, like the woodwork just came out, and I was like, and ultimately I was sort of bullying, sort of aggressively stating my opinion, but also trying to do it for good, and then found myself defending that it was for good. So that's the kind of example about, like, when do we, what's that like? And obviously it's a slippery slope too, but like, how can we use our platform for good, education, And then when does it turn into not? And what I thought was interesting about both these speakers, it's almost like they didn't have to apologize or backtrack, but they had to justify what they do. This is who I follow. This is how I retweet. This is how I use my platform. This is what I've learned over the years. So the conversation really I want to have is where do we draw a line with bullying, or what do we consider with recognizing that shaming, bullying, opinion stating, best intentions, public audience gets complicated.
Well, that's very, okay, Shania.
Go ahead. So I was just going to say, I guess the flip side of that would be accountability, because in some instances, there have been situations where that has been brought to light and it has consequences for those individuals. And so I think in that way, it serves a purpose. I'm not sure if you kind of have an example in mind, but if you need me to clarify, I can further. But anyways, if you have an example in mind, I'm not going to go there.
Thanks, Shaynor. Yeah, I was looking as Ali was talking. It's about 14 minutes into the podcast. He gives this example of a graffiti artist who got caught up and ended up losing his job for defacing rocks in a public park, state and national park. Lost his job, got called out on social media. It was this whole thing, and it was really interesting because if I'm remembering right, the podcast speaker then goes on to say, well, it's really complicated because there's pros to that story in that somebody's held accountable for their work. Shaynor, circling back to your example, right? Somebody's held accountable for their actions, which are unethical in this case, or illegal at least. We haven't discussed the ethicality, but illegal at least. But then there's also cons, because there's he used the expression of bandwagoning that happens, where groups on social media will pile on to the, oh, you shouldn't have done that, that was dumb, or something, and it can get worse and worse and worse, and that compiled with the distance, the anonymity that sometimes comes with social media, or the lack of accountability on the poster's end, can lead to some really terrible stuff, and this we all know. And this conversation is bound up into what's become defined as cancel culture, right? The idea that social media, not just social media, but social media can be used to call out and then shut down a conversation or an idea or an individual for a particular action or statement. And that is a really tricky ethical terrain, because I could imagine a scenario in which you would want to shut down a particular conversation that is really ethically problematic. And yet, on the other hand, to shut down conversations is to put limits on our free speech and our ability to engage with others' opinions. And so this is this ongoing conversation. The Leave No Trace guy called this at one point in his podcast the angry mob mentality, right? That social media, like one person can say, boy, that was a dumb move to deface rocks in a national park. And then all of a sudden 1,000 other people who might be on that same, following that same post might be, yeah, that was terrible. And then all of a sudden there's this compounding digital angry mob coming after the original protester. And again, both podcasters have this sense in which they want to say, well, okay, that's good in some scenarios, but there has to be a balance. There has to be some sort of I read them generously or ingenerously. We kind of have to be nice to each other in social media, build a community and positive reinforcement and all this business. And what they're both working out are the tensions around the limits of positive reinforcement. It's much like parenting a social media baby.
What are some other people's approaches to social media yourself? Like Shanora, you said you only use LinkedIn.
Yeah, just I guess it's just where, my background and how I was raised. And frankly, just I have other interests. Um, and the limited time we have, it's not a priority for me. Um, I travel a lot and I take a lot of pictures and whatnot, and I always am asked to put those on social media, but I just sort of shy away from that. I think for me, it's the entire privacy component. And and so I just don't do it.
Nafisa, I want to call you out here specifically. Like, what's your take on social media? You come from a computer science background, right? Like, professionally and personally, what's your take?
Yeah. So I really like social media. I feel like, well, okay, so like specifically the social media I use, I feel like Instagram is like kind of dead now. Like no one really uses it. But like I use Twitter a lot, and like early like middle school, early like high school, I was like a big fan of like social advocacy and using Twitter to like promote like my ideas and whatnot. And it was like during the time of like when the Syrian like refugee crisis was making like lots of headlines on the news and like all of that stuff. So I use like Twitter and other platforms to really speak on it. And at the time, I felt like a lot of people didn't use social media for that kind of stuff, and or maybe it was just my circle because we were all like early, like freshmen in high school, so people were interested in like other things like Kanye West or like the Kardashian drama. So like no one really cared about like the Syrian refugee crisis. But like over the years, then I started noticing like my circle like expanding, and then them talking about more like issues in like today's society and whatnot. And then it just became really overwhelming. Like at first it was really fun to get like an audience together and like educate people on like the Syrian refugee crisis. And then over time there's just been more issues and like more news circulating. And then you feel like you have to know like literally everything to form an opinion on every social issue, or you're a bad like social advocate or something, because you can speak on like the Syrian crisis, but if you're not talking about Black Lives Matter also, then you can't really say you care for social justice, and it's not that I don't care, I just don't have the knowledge on that kind of information. I didn't really take the time to read that information, so for me to like give an opinion on it, I feel like isn't really my place, and I don't want to like say something bad, especially with like my growing like social media presence, but with people always like spreading news and whatnot, specifically on Twitter, you're kind of just deemed as like a bad person if you don't say anything at all. People would rather have you like say something, even if it be like slightly inaccurate, just so you have like a statement on the issue, whether it be like correct or not. So I feel like some people don't even care about that. People are just saying things for like the purpose of saying stuff, So I feel like that was a growing problem. Other social medias I use, like I use LinkedIn now too, so I know like someone else was saying that. Detrimental to my mental health. I hate it. It's been very sad for me. I open the app and I see like people saying, I'm so happy that I accepted like a summer internship at my dream company also, but I didn't accept a summer internship there. So very depressing for me. Do not like the app. I use it now and then, but I try to limit my screen time. It's very sad.
Makes perfect sense. I can sympathize.
Yeah, there is not much interesting stuff going on there, really. It's pretty dry, so I
It's very depressing.
Well, what you said, Nafisa, got me thinking about what this guy, Emmett from the Emma Audio podcast mentioned. He said at one point, his focus was on staying in his lane. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Like, staying within your expertise. And then I was like, wait. We're listening to an ethics podcast by a guy who makes spoons professionally. So like already there's lane versions. And then he was like, well, what I mean by staying in my lane is I don't share other people's opinions. I share my own beliefs. And I was like, wait. So the other thing that you got me thinking about, and as to this podcast, is the role of expertise, right? It's something we talk about quite a bit in the club and in ethics in general. But like in both of these podcasts, these are not ethics experts. They're not academics. One's a spoon maker, and the other is an off-roader, basically, right? I don't know what the person does professionally apart from that, but in the context of the podcast, off-roading and spoon making, that's what we got. And that's its own form of expertise, but it's very, very different than the sort of expertise that we're cultivating here in like the Be Better Club, but also in ethics education generally. So it makes me wonder, like, to what extent are experts required in ethics generally, right? Does staying in your lane just mean sharing your own belief on social media or elsewhere? And what does that mean when you've got 100 followers versus 1.5 million followers? Staying in your lane takes on a very different role. And this, I think, circling full circle kind of now to another issue, is what people's gripes with Joe Rogan have been. Like, he takes these controversial positions on controversial guests based on, I'm not really sure what, right? Like but the problem with that is not necessarily the perspective he takes or the opinion he shares, but it's the fact that he's got so many followers and such a huge influence. And that's the big deal.
Yeah, I feel like if you have like a big social media presence with like thousands and like millions of followers, I feel like, well, I don't want to say you should like withhold some of your beliefs, but you should definitely see or like consider how it impacts like other people, because you do have like such an influence. People will take your word seriously, and you really can't control how other people react to your news and what you have to say. So I feel like if you have a big social media presence like that, you really have to be careful on like what you say and the impact it has.
So I'm hearing at least two themes appearing, and one of those is about the scale of our impact, right? Based on how many followers we have on social media, that has an influence on social media ethics, but also the proximity of the relationships or the issue. And this is something that we've defined as previously as ethics sensitivity, the idea that there are some issues, or piece of ethics sensitivity, there are some issues that are more salient than others because they hit closer to home, for instance. So that scale of our impact as an influencer on our social media, combined with the intensity of the issue that we're talking about, really ramp up these ethical concerns in social media. And I think in both cases, our spoon maker and our off-roader are both talking to their audiences about issues that are really relevant in that community. And we can pick that up and say, the issue you're talking about, off-roader, is not just about off-roading, but it's relevant in all of these other contexts as well. But at least in that community, it matters a great deal to them right then.
I want to suggest a topic for a future Do Well, Be Better meeting like this, because I think it's related, but there's so much there to unpack. It'd be great to have you find us an expert to come in and talk about this. But there's a little bit of controversy. Maybe it's been around for a while, but it's kind of growing over the role that comedic talk show hosts or comedic commentators on news and current events, what role they really have and what responsibilities they have. So they tend to divide politically, but however they divide, the brewing issue is that some people really get their news from those individuals, or pick up opinions. Their whole opinion, our opinions can be colored to some extent by those comedic parlays of information. And so they've become like journalists. They're in almost a journalist role, spinning it in the form of comedy and satire, and yet they're not beholden to the standards of journalism. And so, what is their responsibility as a content generator? What's our responsibility as a content consumer? And it's an interesting one because so much significant cultural and political transformation has occurred through satire, right? And had we a little more satire and reflection, in some cases, we might have avoided and averted some problems in past history. So I think it's an interesting topic, because there too, you wouldn't want to say, okay, no more satire. You have to stay in your lane. You either do, knock jokes, or you do proper journalism. Nary the twain shall meet. and yet it raises this conundrum of responsibility on both the side of the content generator and the consumer. So future topic, please.
That's a really good one, actually. I don't know if you guys like watch, he's on Netflix, but Hassan Minhaj, the Patriot Act, like his show is called Patriot Act. He does like, political commentary and that kind of stuff, and it's really interesting. He covers like domestic issues and like international, like foreign affairs and whatnot. And he had this one episode about Saudi Arabia on it, and he called out the Crown Prince, MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, right? And that episode got removed from Netflix in Saudi Arabia because he was calling out the prime minister, and they don't allow that. They hate that. But it was so interesting to me, and he did so many like interviews with the prime minister of like Canada, and he has like some episodes criticizing the prime minister of India and like all of those stuff, and he's like great. I love him. You guys should like definitely watch him. But Netflix canceled his stuff, and everyone was so angry because this was like the first time you actually got real, like authentic and like meaningful brown like Muslim representation on a big platform like Netflix. And he's doing his job. Like he's calling out dictators and world leaders and whatnot, and he's holding them accountable. He's doing it in a funny medium. He's not like bashing them, but he's still like, it's a good show and stuff. But Netflix canceled it, and people were saying like they care more about collecting profits like most big corporations do. And they're saying that they canceled it because he called out Mohammed bin Salman, the president or prime minister of Saudi Arabia, and he's causing problems with other world leaders, and Netflix can't afford that kind of issue going on, so they had to let his show go. But yeah, we should really talk about that. I like that topic, and I'll send some like links to his show. It's really good.
Yeah, please do. If you say, and Dr. Kubler, if we do this, we're going to have to call it knock knock journalism, because that works. I know we're at time, friends, so I want to thank you all for being here again. And in the meantime, until we meet again, do well and be better. And we'll see you on April 13th for a talk on discussion about AI ethics and autonomous vehicles.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye, guys. It's nice
Thank you.
seeing you all.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.